Mr. Mays, Mrs. Griffin, Miss Robinson, my fellow classmates, and the rest of society. My name is Maddie Hancock, and today I stand before you to shed light on a matter that has haunted humanity since the beginning of time: mass murder. It is a reality that we cannot afford to ignore. The economic, emotional, and societal toll it takes on our world is immense. Each year, over 17,000 people lose their lives to murder in the United States alone. 17,000 people. This equates to a staggering $255 billion economic burden annually around the world when you take into account that the cost per murder is over $17 million. But it's not just the financial costs that we should be concerned about. The social and emotional changes brought about by murders raise important questions. What drives these individuals to abandon all empathy and morality? Are all serial killers mentally ill? And how should we punish those who are mentally ill or psychologically unfit? Today, I will specifically be talking about serial killers within the realm of mass murderers and murderers. Let us first delve into the psychology of serial killers. A serial killer is someone who has committed 3 or more murders over an extended period of time, usually with a cooling off period between each murder. Their motivations are often psychological, and they tend to display certain patterns in their killings. Childhood abuse or trauma is often found to lead to the development of psychological or mental issues in these killers. They often exhibit behaviors such as aggression, psychopathy, and insanity. Many show signs of sexual dysfunction, with sexual gratification or power playing a role in their crimes. These individuals experience an intense emotional response during or after their killings, known as thrill seeking, which provides them with a sense of adrenaline and pleasure, causing them to commit even more crimes like this. So what explains their behavior? Developmental effects, biological makeup, environmental factors, and psychological disorders all contribute to the actions of serial killers. Understanding the psychology of these individuals is absolutely crucial in determining how to handle them, prevent future crimes, and protect the rest of society from people like them. Current policies pertaining to the psychology of criminals include criminal responsibility, sentencing, assessment of risk, and the defense of insanity. When it comes to criminal responsibility, individuals are considered responsible for their crime if they know what they are doing, understand that it is wrong, and are able to control their actions. However, in some cases, criminals may claim that they were legally insane or experienced temporary insanity during or after their killing. When individuals are found guilty of serial murders, sentencing policies vary and usually include life sentences in prison or the death penalty. Additionally, criminals are subject to risk assessments, which evaluate their risk of reoffending and hurting other members of society. Finally, if accused criminals argue that they are legally insane or experience temporary insanity, they may not be held accountable for their actions. The psychological and mental state of a serial killer should be weighed heavily when determining their sentence, as it is the most obvious indicator of their motivation for committing the crime, their risk of reoffending, and what sentence is the most just and deserved to inflict upon them. In criminal justice, the transcendental virtue of justice is the fair, fitting, and correct treatment of those who have broken laws and hurt other people. We must evaluate serial killers' mental state, motivations, and potential for reoffending. Incarceration serves as a means of delivering justice in multiple ways, including the corrective and punishing tool that helps punish those who have committed crimes, and it also protects the other members of society who could be in danger if the serial killer was loose. The government and legal system have the power to inflict these legal punishments and they are entrusted with this responsibility by the people through the democratic process, which is essential to maintaining a just and orderly society. Now, let us take a closer look at some examples of the impact of psychology on criminal behavior and sentencing. But before jumping into these two examples, I'd like to invite you to keep in mind that research shows that 80% of serial killers show evidence of having severe mental health issues or psychological problems. So while I'm only considering 2 men today, keep in mind that 4 in 5 serial killers show many similar problems and psychological factors as they do. The first example comes from Fyodor Dostoevsky's book, Crime and Punishment, which I read in the beginning of my 12th grade year here. Dostoevsky portrays the protagonist, Raskolnikov, who has various mental illnesses, leading him to commit a double homicide. Raskolnikov's mental state should be heavily considered when determining his risk of reoffending and what we should do with him. Where does he go? How do we punish someone who has committed murder on 2 different people? Raskolnikov's inflated sense of self-importance showcases his narcissistic personality disorder, and his depression contributes to his lack of empathy towards his victims. Raskolnikov has obsessive thoughts about committing murder and is unable to control his impulses, suffering from OCD or obsessive-compulsive disorder. Raskolnikov's lack of guilt is indicative of a deeply disturbing psychological state, with a disregard for human life and well-being and a lack of empathy towards his victims. Another example, Lawrence Bittaker, is known as one of the toolbox killers for abducting, raping, torturing, and brutally murdering 5 young, innocent teenage girls. However, Bittaker's criminal activity did not start here. Over 15 years before he was convicted for the murders of these 5 girls, psychiatrists identified but did not treat his psychological incompetence. During his second prison sentence for robbery, psychiatrists characterized Bittaker as highly manipulative and having considerable concealed hostility. They diagnosed him as being a borderline psychopath and a highly manipulative individual unable to acknowledge the consequences of his actions. In prison, Bittaker revealed that his crimes made him feel powerful and important, and circumstantial matters related to his upbringing decreased his ability to resist the compulsion of committing crimes. Bittaker was prescribed antipsychotic medication, and despite all of these obvious warning signs of his psychological incompetence to exist in the world around the rest of society, they released him back into the world after only 1 year of imprisonment. Over the next 15 years, Bittaker continued to commit heinous crimes, such as rape and assault, none of which kept him in prison. The best course of action would be to keep Bittaker locked up, whether in prison or in a mental facility, so he was not a risk to the rest of society. We could have prevented the murders, rapes, and tortures of these 5 girls by having a better legal system and more strict punishment. Bittaker's absence of guilt in the multiple murders and rapes of young, helpless, innocent girls showcases his deeply disturbing psychological state and his lack of guilt and empathy. The ego, id, and superego, according to Sigmund Freud, an Australian neurologist and philosopher, and the founder of psychoanalysis, is another way to explain how the psyche of a criminal influences their actions. The instinctual drives, or id, is the primitive and irrational part of the psyche, which is driven by instinctual needs such as hunger and sex. Criminals who act impulsively and without considering the consequences of their actions are influenced by the id. The superego is the moral part of the psyche, representing societal and cultural values. Legal offenders violating societal laws may lack a superego or have a not well-developed one. This absence of a superego can lead them to commit heinous crimes. Finally, the ego is the rational part of the psyche that balances the demands of the id and the ego. Criminals who engage in calculated crimes do not have a well-developed ego, which rationalizes their actions for the correct means. It is important to recognize that criminals with severe mental health issues are also more likely to commit suicide or be victimized while in prison. While individuals with greater mental health needs should be given appropriate support and care, they should not, under any circumstance, be given a lesser prison sentence, only due to their condition. Research suggests that criminals with psychological disorders have a higher risk of reoffending and hurting those around them. Mental health problems such as addiction, personality disorders, and psychosis are all linked to an increased likelihood of criminal behavior. Thus, psychological evaluations should consider the risk of recidivism or reoffending and treatment recommendations for psychological treatment. In conclusion, by evaluating the psychology of serial killers, we can gain insight into their motivations, their mental state, and their potential for reoffending. When determining a just sentence, careful consideration should be given to their motivation for committing the crime and their risk of reoffending. Mental health should be taken into consideration when devising treatment and intervention plans for offenders, irrespective of the severity of their crimes. However, criminals with severe mental health should not, under any circumstance, be given a lesser sentence due to their mental state. Treatment should be prioritized, providing appropriate care to those who have committed crimes and their distorted mindsets. With these efforts combined, we can promote justice and safety for all members of society. Thank you. Okay, if y'all have any questions, let me know.
So, you touched on it a little bit in your thesis, is the treatment piece of it. If you could expand on, what the prevention piece, like how do you determine that, right? Like what?
Yeah.
You laid out kind of, hey, these are the things, the cause and effect thing, right? So how do you prevent it necessarily?
Yeah.
Once you determine it.
Right. I think prevention is absolutely key. I think the best way to do this is to do, like I said in my thesis, in my speech, doing psychological evaluations on not just those who have committed crimes against people, but also those who have done robberies, such as bid taker, and other crimes that just show a lack of a well-developed moral or a conscience. Those all show that they may have a weaker ego and those kinds of things. So if we can start doing psychological evaluations early for all criminals who showcase these lack of compassion and empathy and morality, then we can help to prevent it. Another way that we can help prevent it is often there's this thing called the triad, which is very prevalent in serial killers. It includes 3 characteristics that most serial killers showed when they were children, which includes pyromania, an obsession with fire, bedwetting after the age of 5, and then also an obsession with hurting animals or killing animals. So if we are able to acknowledge, and parents are able to step in and acknowledge that these bad things are happening, and be able to put their children in psychological institutions that are able to help them build a conscience and morality, because I do think those things can be built upon, then I think we can prevent it.
So how do we, I'm assuming you're leaning towards like the psychological treatment or housing those individuals. So at what point is what I'm getting at is, where, before they prevent murder, before they attempt a murder or complete a murder, right? Like what's the trigger then, right? How do we decide who gets put in a facility? That duality of
I think their actions are what, when they commit an action, they're honestly giving up part of their freedom because they were unjust to other people's freedom. So I think when they have committed an action, that's a crime. according to American law, then they are subject to be put in prison. But I think the point at which we should put them in a psychological institution or prison is after we do the psychological evaluations and see what is their risk of doing this again. Because honestly, psychological evaluations are very in-depth and intense and really important to understanding their motivations, which I think once we see that they are psychologically unfit, that's when we put them in a psychological institution. Does that answer?
It does. I mean, just I wanted to kind of expand it. It's really what you laid out is the mental health. Like there's a mental, psychological piece of this. Or the main piece. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
So would it not be easier just to, if these individuals are already taking the lives of other individuals, are hurting them in ways that are immense, why not just the death penalty kill them?
I do think that the death penalty is really important in some scenarios, and it is the best action. However, when a criminal shows that they have an opportunity for growth, if they have an opportunity to have a bit of a conscience built into them, or if they were acting on insanity or had that defense and it truly was insanity, I think in those cases it's more empathetic of us if we choose to put them in prison or a psychological institution rather than just the death penalty, because we give them a chance to improve. And when I do agree that when someone is committing multiple murders, obviously in a situation like that, they're not showing that they're using their second chances or their third or fourth chance as well. So in those situations, I do think the death penalty should be used. Okay, for payment, I think that taxpayers, I know Ms. Griffin is probably not happy with me saying taxpayers.
Well, we do anyway.
But we are already spending our money on that, and I think that nothing is more important than the opportunity for safety. And that's one of the things, we obviously value freedom, but when we pay our money in order for the safety of ourselves and for the treatment of these people, I think that, and honestly, the psychological institution, the death penalty costs a ton of money too. So in both situations, it's going to cost. But I think it's worth it if we spend our money on that in order to protect, like with Bidtager, in order to protect these young girls and all of these people who are getting these injustices committed against them. Does that answer? Okay.
Yeah, society pays a great cost whether the individuals are reoffenders and they are repeatedly using police officers, court time, lawyers, and then they're incarcerated. The taxpayers pay one way or the other. Regardless of whether they're out or they're in so many ways. So my question, and so you brought up how the age, how early on they are noticing signs and so on. So we know we have people that commit murder that are teenagers.
Yes.
And some of them have no desire, no remorse whatsoever, and they have said they would do it again. So would you be for the death penalty even when they're 18, 17? The argument is that they're not old enough to understand. So would you say that they should have the death penalty if they show no sign of remorse?
That's a great question. I think that psychologically, the human brain isn't developed until the age of like 25. So I think maybe at that age of 17 or 18 where they're committing these crimes, I do think that it could honestly change. If they don't feel any remorse now, maybe that's something that can be built into them. I do think that people learn empathy and morality throughout, like it's a nurture and nature thing. So if they are nurtured and through these psychological things that give intensive care in order to help them learn the depth of the crime they are committing, I think that it could be prevented that way. I'm not for the death penalty for teenagers if they still have the opportunity for their brains to develop more.
Maybe at some point in their adult life they can be reevaluated, and if they're still not remorseful, then
yeah, in that instance, and they've committed multiple crimes, then I do think that the death penalty is the right situation for that.
I have a second question too. So we all know the picture of Lady Justice, and she's blindfolded, right? Justice is supposed to be blind, and we have experts that give these observations, and they give these questionnaires, and they evaluate, and they hand that information over to our courts and say, these are my recommendations, this is what I've observed. we have, so much evidence, why do you suspect people still do not uphold that which is just, despite all this evidence by, psychiatrists and all these experts and third parties and such, that people do not want to be that person that says, yeah, but, we fail to uphold justice for the victims, for society, people don't want to be labeled, but we have way too much mercy and grace, whatever the words might be that people want to call it, right? But the victims get no justice, so why is it that justice fails to be blind in these kinds of cases, and overwhelmingly these repeat offenders go?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I think that our thoughts of what justice is, I do think that it's a transcendental virtue. I think that there is a true definition of what is just in every scenario. But I do think that as humans, we do have ideas that may be wrong and opinions. So I think that the reason that it's not upheld to the greatest capacity is because us as humans, we have flaws, and so people are showing much more empathy, like you said, or mercy in situations when someone has already used their chance. And I think that it goes back to human flaw, but I also think that empathy is a good thing to have, and we should have morality and those kinds of things. So it is a tricky question. I think that we can still have empathy without putting other people at danger. We can still have justice and empathy at the same time through, I think, primarily promoting justice and then empathy after that. Does that answer? Great response.
I have another question.
Yes.
Could you not argue that when you were explaining that a lot of these signs of psychopathy and serial killers starts at a very young age, that it should be more focused on the parent and their responsibility of raising that child and noticing these things and taking the correct actions before they even get up to that point? Should there be more of a taxpayer amount of money spent on educating these parents, or should it be more spent on after they've already failed to parent their child in a way that benefited them?
Yeah. So I do think that people are responsible for their own actions. I do not believe any of the parents are responsible for the actions of their child. However, I do think that they have the opportunity to help the children. Like you said, it's a nurture thing. Nurture them into having compassion and morality and a sense of justice so they don't commit these crimes. I don't think that taxpayer dollars should go into educating the parents. I think that is something that parents, when they have a child, they should already have that ability to teach their child. But I do think that it is important that we step in. So I think that's an opportunity for school teachers or people around them to understand when this child is not getting the appropriate care and teaching. And I think there's so many opportunities for the parents or for the teachers to help as well and build that child up. Morality. Answer? Okay. Awesome. Yes.
Kind of a similar question. It's just a theoretical one I want to hear your response on. So a lot of this topic, rightly so, is reactive, right? We're reacting to actions that are formed, right? And so that makes sense, but we're also a little bit talking about being proactive of how to prevent these things. And so I see the balance that you're trying to reach in your thesis. How would you respond to someone suggesting that either maybe at the age of 16 or 18, so 16 for driver's license or 18 for being legal adults, for them to have a mandatory psychological evaluation at that point across the board, all American citizens supposed to do that?
Yeah, I did not think of that idea before, but it is a great question. I think that, like I said, psychological evaluations are really important, but it is a restriction on the rights of privacy. So I think that when someone has not committed a crime yet, there is really no reason for the government to invade their privacy and do a psychological check, because that is into their medical state. However, I do think that it is a good option for if a parent thinks this is a good idea for their child, or if the child themselves, there's a lot of reasons that a psychological evaluation could be important, and not just protecting or preventing the development of these serial killers. But yeah, I think it's an interesting idea, but I do think that it inflicts on their freedom.
Right.
I have another question.
Yes.
So, the basis of all of our knowledge of serial killers comes from a very recent discovery in the FBI of the Yvonne Analysis Unit because of one serial killer who's decided to open up and explain his feelings and his virtues and his reasonings behind things. Would you say that only 30, no more like 80 years worth of education on the very minimal use of serial killers is enough to psychologically evaluate someone enough to be able to decide their fate?
I think yes, because if those 80 years of psychological evaluations and knowledge and studies have been done, I do think that's enough to understand how we can determine when another person is going to commit that, as long as there's enough examples. For one of when I talked about Lawrence Bittaker, I used a book called Alone with the Devil by Bosco Markman, and that was a fascinating book about in-depth of the mind of how Bittaker responded to certain scenarios and why he thought like this. So I do think that those 80 years worth of knowledge and history and those kinds of things, I think they're enough to determine the fate of new serial killers and criminals.
Do you think that later down the road, with more evidence and more research done, that this ideology of giving more mental health facilities, giving them more help and everything could be flexible and mended and kind of fit to where our society is at this current moment and later on?
Yeah, I do think so. I think it's important for a government. Obviously, we have a constitution, which stays the same because the founders knew that this is something that could change with time. Like, it's moldable to the society. But I do think that new laws that are put into place, they have the ability to change and be able to be adapted to where society is at that time. If that answers your question. Okay. So, do you have time for anyone?